What if you could turn back time? What if the key to aging stronger, not weaker, was hidden in something as simple as the food you eat? Henry Montgomery, a retired aerospace engineer, stood in front of his bathroom mirror one early morning, running his hand through his thinning gray hair. His reflection looked back at him with tired eyes, worn from years of work, family life, and the slow but inevitable creeping of time. The wrinkles on his face were a badge of experience, each one telling a different story. But the one thing that had never been part of his story until now was pain. The pain of aging. The cramps. The stiff joints. The nights where his legs would seize up, and he'd wake up in the middle of the night, desperate for relief. He never thought much about his body when he was younger, always able to push it harder, run a little faster, hike a little further. But now, as he crossed the threshold into his late 60s, it felt like his body had turned on him. The muscles that had once carried him through countless hours of work, physical activity, and even adventure, now seemed to betray him every time he tried to get out of bed. Henry knew that aging was inevitable. He had seen his parents grow older, his friends face the challenges that came with getting older. But he had always held on to one thing, the belief that he would be different. He'd always been active, always maintained his physical health, and he expected that as he aged, his body would at least continue to support him. But now, with every morning's stiffness and the cramps that plagued him during the day, it felt as if his body had its own agenda. It wasn't until one afternoon, sitting in his favorite armchair with a cup of coffee in hand, that his life would take a small but pivotal turn. The evening news was on, but Henry wasn't really paying attention until the name Elon Musk jumped out at him from the screen. Did you know that one of the most innovative minds in the world believes that eating certain foods can help you age stronger? The host said with a smirk. And we're not talking about some new tech gadget or futuristic pill. We're talking about food, real food. Foods that could help seniors like you avoid those debilitating cramps and joint pains. How? Well, Musk says it's all about potassium, magnesium, and vitamin D-rich foods. Henry sat up straight. His curiosity piqued. Musk, of all people, was talking about something that could help seniors like him. The billionaire tech mogul who had revolutionized space travel, cars, and even the way we think about the future, was now talking about food. And not just any food, foods that could help him, Henry Montgomery, live a stronger, more comfortable life. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning, the host added. Then, with a smile, the segment cut to a montage of fresh produce, bananas, leafy greens, and glistening salmon. Henry paused the video. He was skeptical, sure. He had tried plenty of remedies in the past, over-the-counter pills, stretching routines, even acupuncture, but nothing seemed to truly ease the constant tightness in his muscles or the pain that gripped his joints. But this was different. Musk wasn't just some health influencer, he was a visionary. If there was even a fraction of truth to what Musk was suggesting, could this be the breakthrough he had been waiting for? Bananas. Spinach. Salmon, Henry muttered to himself, as he reached for his phone. He had no idea if those foods would make any difference, but he was willing to try. At this point, anything felt worth a shot. After all, the cramps were only getting worse. His hands gripped the phone as he typed, his mind already racing with possibilities. Could food really help him reclaim some of his old strength? For the first time in months, Henry felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to take control of his body again. Without needing to rely on medications or endless stretching routines that only offered fleeting relief. Maybe the answer was as simple as eating the right foods. He was about to find out. The screen on his phone displayed a comment thread beneath the video. People were already sharing their thoughts on Musk's advice. Some seemed skeptical, others intrigued. One person shared how they had tried the diet for a week and felt more energized. Another commented about the benefits of magnesium-rich spinach in calming muscle cramps. There was a buzz in the air, a collective curiosity, a sense of wonder. But as he scrolled, one comment caught his eye: "What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" It was an invitation to engage, to share his own thoughts. A simple question, yet something about it resonated deeply with Henry. The question felt personal. He wasn't just sitting there as a passive observer anymore. For the first time in a while, he felt like he had a choice. He could either keep doing things the way he had always done them, accepting that aging was something to endure, or he could take a chance on something new. He put the phone down, took a deep breath, and looked at his reflection again. This time, it wasn't just his aging face staring back. It was the face of someone who was about to take a step into the unknown. It wasn't just about food or muscle cramps anymore. It was about reclaiming a sense of control over his own life. He decided, then and there, to give it a try. He would get the foods Musk had recommended and see if they could truly make a difference. "Here's to aging stronger," Henry whispered to himself with a smile. Maybe this was the beginning of something new after all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Henry Montgomery had lived a full life, one rich with accomplishments, love, and, like anyone else, struggles. At 68, his days now felt quieter, slower, and less purposeful than they once had. But he still held on to a thread of pride, the remnants of his younger self, when he was sharp, quick-witted, and physically strong. Born in a small town in Oregon, Henry grew up in a family of engineers. His father, a mechanic by trade, instilled in him a sense of curiosity about how things worked, whether it was cars, planes, or gadgets. His mother, a nurse, had taught him the importance of taking care of his body. She would often make him eat vegetables, despite his childhood protests, and would always say, "Strong bodies make strong minds." It had become one of those sayings Henry heard over and over, almost like a mantra. At the time, he'd rolled his eyes at it, but now, decades later, it seemed prophetic. From an early age, Henry had been a natural athlete. He played football in high school, excelled in track and field, and had a love for hiking in the Oregon wilderness. His physicality became a cornerstone of his identity. He wasn't just the smart kid in class, he was also the one who could run the fastest and climb the highest. As he moved into his 20s and 30s, his work life began to take precedence. His ambition led him to study aerospace engineering, which eventually landed him a job at a leading space exploration company in California. For years, Henry poured himself into his work, taking on long hours, challenging projects, and playing a key role in some of the biggest breakthroughs in the aerospace industry. His colleagues admired him for his drive and expertise. Henry had always been the go-to person when something needed fixing or innovating. He thrived on problem-solving, whether it was in the lab or in the field. But what he didn't realize was that his constant focus on work had come at a cost: his personal life. While his career flourished, his relationships began to suffer. His marriage to Rebecca, his college sweetheart, was slowly unraveling. He'd been so consumed with his professional life that he hadn't noticed how much his wife, and eventually his children, needed him. The busy work schedule, the constant travel, and the stress of his job left little room for family. Rebecca, once his biggest supporter, grew frustrated, her own dreams sidelined in favor of his ambitions. She would often say to him, "Henry, you're chasing the future, but I'm right here. And so are the kids." Eventually, they divorced, and though Henry tried to bury himself in his work, a deep sense of loss followed him. His children, now grown and with lives of their own, still made time for him, but the distance between them had grown over the years. He regretted not being there more for them during their formative years. But life had a way of moving forward, and all he could do was keep up with it, sometimes running to avoid facing the things that hurt the most. Despite the emotional toll, Henry didn't allow his physical health to slip. He continued his regular hiking trips and worked out whenever he could. He was still a man who believed in the power of physical strength, even as his personal life faltered. But as he hit his late 60s, the aches and pains became harder to ignore. The long hikes that once felt effortless now required days of recovery. He could no longer keep up with the young bucks on his team at the local gym, and his evenings were often spent massaging his sore muscles. The old advice his mother had given him, strong bodies make strong minds, felt more like a distant dream than a reality. The cramps had started small at first, a mild twinge here and there, easy to shake off. But over the years, they became more persistent, more frequent. Henry would wake up in the middle of the night with searing pain in his calves, or his hamstrings would tighten painfully while he tried to enjoy a walk. It wasn't just the cramps, it was the exhaustion that came with them. His body no longer felt like it was supporting him. It felt as if it was failing him. He had seen doctors, tried every remedy under the sun, stretching, medications, even natural therapies like essential oils. Yet, nothing seemed to work for long. He had always been so self-reliant, so determined to fix things himself, but this was one problem that stubbornly resisted any solution. Sarah, his only daughter, had become increasingly concerned. She was a nutritionist, well-versed in the benefits of food for the body, and every time they spoke, she'd urge him to try new dietary changes. She'd tell him to eat more leafy greens, cut back on processed foods, and focus on hydration. But Henry, a creature of habit, had never been one to jump on the health bandwagon without solid proof. His skepticism grew as the years wore on, especially when faced with so many fads that promised miracles but never delivered. But something about the advice he heard in the video stuck with him. Elon Musk, of all people, was talking about foods that could help seniors age better. Henry, the seasoned engineer, could appreciate Musk's attention to detail and innovation. If Musk said these foods could help prevent cramps, then maybe, just maybe, there was something to it. As Henry sat at the kitchen table the morning after watching the video, he thought about how much his life had changed. He had more time now, more opportunity to focus on himself. He was no longer burdened by the demands of work, and though he sometimes felt isolated, the idea of taking charge of his health, of having the energy to move and explore again, appealed to him. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Sarah, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to try something new. Could you send me a list of those foods you've been telling me about? Bananas, spinach, salmon, right?" He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It felt like a small step, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Henry sat down at his kitchen table, his phone still in hand, staring at the message he'd sent to Sarah. It was an odd feeling. For years, he had prided himself on being the one who had the answers, the one who solved problems. But now, he was asking for help. Something that didn't come easily for him. The thought of relying on someone else, even his daughter, left him feeling vulnerable. Yet, the truth was undeniable, his body was betraying him. The slow, creeping pain of aging had become his constant companion. Each morning, his joints felt more rigid, his muscles more sluggish. The once effortless act of getting out of bed now took careful deliberation. When he moved, it wasn't fluid. It was a series of cautious steps, as if his own body was warning him that it might give out at any moment. The cramps were worse at night, sometimes so bad they would wake him from a deep sleep, leaving him twisting in agony until the muscles finally relaxed. His doctor had shrugged it off. "It's just part of getting older," the physician had said with a dismissive wave. "Keep exercising, stay hydrated, and maybe try some over-the-counter supplements." That advice hadn't helped much. So, when the news segment had piqued his curiosity, he felt something stir inside him, a desire to try, just once, something different. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Dad, I'm really proud of you for taking this step. Here's the list you asked for. I think you'll start feeling better once you get more magnesium, potassium, and vitamin D in your system. You can't rely on supplements forever, real food is the key." Sarah's enthusiasm came through even in the text, and it gave him a small sense of comfort. She had always been the thoughtful one, constantly researching ways to optimize health, and her support meant a lot. Henry scanned the list she sent him. 1. Bananas, high in potassium, great for muscle function. 2. Spinach, loaded with magnesium, helps with cramps and muscle relaxation. 3. Salmon, rich in vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids, beneficial for joint health. These weren't the latest miracle foods or supplements, just simple, natural ingredients. Yet, they had the backing of a mind like Elon Musk's, and that gave Henry a sense of hope. Still, he had his doubts. Could something as basic as food really change the way he felt day to day? Henry had never been one to jump on trends, especially when they seemed to promise results that were too good to be true. But this was different. Musk, a man who had revolutionized space travel and electric cars, had made the connection between food and aging strong. The thought of feeling physically capable again, of waking up without the aching in his legs, was enough to make Henry willing to give it a shot. He spent the next day going through his local grocery store, picking up the foods Sarah had recommended. Bananas, spinach, salmon. Each item seemed so simple, yet the more Henry thought about it, the more he realized how disconnected he had become from his own body over the years. He had spent so much time focusing on work, on tasks, on the future, that he had neglected one crucial thing, himself. As he loaded his shopping cart, a thought gnawed at him: what if this didn't work? What if these foods didn't have the miraculous effect he was hoping for? Henry wasn't the type to expect instant results, but there was something about the idea of aging gracefully that had ignited a spark in him. He knew the reality of aging, he had seen it in his own parents, in the faces of friends who had started to slow down. Was he destined to be just another person whose body betrayed them, or could this small dietary change really make a difference? The next morning, he cooked up a breakfast of scrambled eggs with spinach and a side of banana slices. It felt right. It felt like he was taking a step toward something better. The simple act of preparing his food thoughtfully, knowing that each bite was part of a larger plan, brought a sense of control back into his life. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was something. For the next few days, Henry stuck to the regimen: spinach in his smoothies, bananas as snacks, salmon for dinner. At first, the changes were subtle. His muscles didn't immediately stop aching, and he still woke up with stiffness. But there was a difference, a small one that Henry couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of difference that hit you over the head, but more of a quiet shift. His body felt less stiff in the mornings, and the cramps were less frequent. He was even starting to feel less fatigued by the end of the day. He had been sleeping more soundly, too. Henry wasn't sure if it was the food or if he was just more aware of his body now, but he didn't care. Something was happening. He couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like a shift he hadn't felt in years. Maybe the answer wasn't in some magical supplement or breakthrough invention, but in something simpler: food. However, the real test came when he went on a hike with his old friend, Dave, who had been one of his hiking buddies for years. They hadn't gone on a long trek together in nearly a year due to Henry's increasing discomfort, but this time, Henry felt a glimmer of hope. The hike was challenging, but Henry managed to keep pace with Dave, even outpacing him on some of the uphill stretches. His legs didn't cramp. He didn't feel the familiar tightness that usually crept in after an hour of walking. For the first time in a long while, he felt normal. It wasn't the old Henry, the one who had been able to run 10 miles without thinking twice, but it was a start. After the hike, sitting on a rock overlooking the vast, green landscape, Dave turned to him. "You've been looking better, Henry. Are you finally getting your act together with all that food stuff Sarah's been recommending?" Henry chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Maybe. I don't know yet. But I'm feeling better, and that's enough for now." Dave raised an eyebrow. "You might be onto something, my friend. I've been thinking about cutting out all the junk I've been eating, too. Maybe it's time for all of us to start listening to our bodies." It was that simple. Henry didn't need validation from others. He didn't need to prove anything. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right track, even if he couldn't yet fully explain why. But there was a growing sense of conflict beneath the surface. The changes were positive, yes, but they were still small. And as much as he was beginning to believe in the power of these foods, there was always that nagging doubt at the back of his mind. What if it was just a temporary relief? What if the cramps came back with a vengeance? The road ahead still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Henry was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The sun was high in the sky as Henry stood at the foot of Mount Hood, a familiar sight in the distance. The hike he had planned wasn't the longest one he'd ever attempted, but it felt like a monumental challenge today. His body, still adjusting to the changes in his diet, was in unfamiliar territory. He had always prided himself on his ability to push through discomfort, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't simply fighting against exhaustion or pushing past his physical limits. He was challenging his own beliefs about aging and how much control he still had over his body. With his backpack loaded with water and snacks, Henry turned to his old friend Dave. Dave, a robust man in his early 70s, grinned back at him with a contagious enthusiasm that reminded Henry of his younger self. "Ready, Henry?" Dave asked, adjusting his sunglasses. "Ready as I'll ever be," Henry replied, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. He still didn't fully believe that eating a few specific foods could change everything. After all, he'd been an engineer his entire life, a man of logic and facts, not someone who easily bought into trends or vague promises. But the changes were undeniable. Even though the cramps hadn't completely disappeared, they had lessened. The soreness that once lingered for days after a hike now seemed to fade faster. Henry's mornings, which once began with stiffness and a slow stretch of his body, had transformed into a more fluid routine. His energy levels had improved, and he wasn't as fatigued at the end of the day. For the first time in a long time, he could feel something like hope stirring within him, just below the surface. They started walking, the trail winding up the side of the mountain, a steady incline that would get their hearts pumping. The air was cool but crisp, and the scent of pine filled the space between the trees. The rhythmic sound of their boots crunching on the gravel path was comforting, the only noise that broke the silence of the wilderness. For the first half of the hike, Henry felt great. His legs were strong, his breath steady. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his face and the cool breeze against his skin. Every step was a reminder that he was moving forward, not just physically, but in a deeper, more profound way. Dave, noticing Henry's steady pace, gave him an approving nod. "You're keeping up better than I thought. Those foods working their magic, huh?" "I guess so," Henry replied, smiling. "I'm feeling good. It's strange. I wasn't sure if they'd make any difference, but I think they're helping." As they neared the summit, the climb became steeper. The terrain changed, the rocks underfoot becoming more uneven. Henry's heart rate increased, and a slight breathlessness started to creep in. It wasn't a panic, but rather the normal discomfort that came with a strenuous hike. He focused on his steps, the steady rhythm of his boots, the increasing burn in his legs. And then, just as the trail curved sharply, he felt it. The tightness. The familiar, unsettling sensation in his calf muscles. A cramp. His heart skipped a beat as he slowed down, his hand instinctively reaching for the muscle that was beginning to seize up. Dave, a few steps ahead, turned back with a frown. "You all right, Henry?" Henry winced and took a deep breath, trying to ease the pain. The cramp was different this time, though. It wasn't as intense as the ones he'd suffered before. The sharpness of it, while unpleasant, seemed to fade faster. He bent down and massaged the muscle gently, still feeling a twinge of disbelief. "I'm okay," he muttered, though his voice held a trace of concern. "It's just a little cramp. Nothing like before." Dave, ever the optimist, clapped him on the back. "See? Told you it would get better. Just a little bump in the road, my friend." Henry nodded, but he wasn't entirely convinced. The cramp was there, still a reminder of his age, of the body that was slowly but surely showing signs of wear. But as he stood up and stretched his leg, he noticed something else. The pain was already starting to subside, much faster than usual. They continued the ascent, and though the cramp lingered faintly, Henry's body seemed to bounce back faster. Every time the pain flared up, it was shorter-lived. And the more he walked, the more he realized that his body wasn't failing him, it was adapting. Slowly, he was learning to trust it again. He had spent so many years pushing through pain, but now, he was working with his body, listening to its cues, and treating it with the respect it deserved. As they reached the top of the mountain, Henry couldn't help but pause and take in the breathtaking view. The sight of the world stretching out before him, the jagged peaks of the Cascades in the distance, filled him with a sense of awe. The air was thin up here, but fresh. The wind whipped through his hair, a sensation that felt like freedom itself. Dave, standing beside him, let out a contented sigh. "This is what it's all about, huh?" Henry smiled. "Yeah, it really is." For a few moments, they simply stood there, taking it all in. The struggle of the climb, the nagging doubt, the cramp, it all faded into the background. Henry felt something that had been missing for a long time, a connection to the world around him, to his body, and to his past self. The one who had once believed that anything was possible if you put your mind to it. As they began their descent, Henry's mind wandered back to the foods Sarah had recommended. Bananas, spinach, salmon. Simple foods. Simple changes. But in that moment, they didn't seem so simple anymore. He had spent so much time chasing complex solutions, trying to outsmart aging, when the answers were in front of him all along. It wasn't about outpacing the clock. It was about learning to move with it, to work with his body and give it the fuel it needed to keep going. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he was on the right path, not just for his body, but for his life as a whole. The cramps were still there, lurking in the background. But they no longer ruled him. As they made their way back down the mountain, Henry knew that this journey was far from over. There would be days of doubt, days when the cramps would return with a vengeance. But there would also be days like today, when he would push through and realize that the battle wasn't against age or time, it was about how he chose to live. And that, for him, was the greatest victory of all. The weeks following the hike were a blur of progress and setbacks, but for Henry, something had shifted deep inside. The days were longer now, and the feeling of cramping had, for the most part, receded. He woke up less stiff, moved more fluidly, and felt a renewed sense of energy that he hadn't experienced in years. Yet, there was something beneath the surface that kept him from fully relaxing into his new routine. A creeping anxiety, the fear that his improvements might be fleeting, still clung to him. It wasn't until one particular evening, when his leg seized up again in the middle of the night, that the weight of this fear truly hit him. He was lying in bed, sound asleep, when the sharp, familiar pain of a cramp shot through his calf. It was like a bolt of lightning, searing through his muscles, pulling him out of his slumber. He gasped in pain and instinctively curled his toes, trying to ease the knot that had formed in his leg. The cramp was excruciating, so much so that he couldn't help but gasp out loud. "Not again," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. He had thought he was past this. He had been eating the right foods, exercising carefully, and following all the advice he had been given. So why was his body betraying him once more? The pain stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. When it finally loosened, Henry collapsed back into his pillow, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The night was still, but the sound of his own breath, harsh and ragged, filled the space around him. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Was this just part of getting older, or had he been fooling himself all along? The brief sense of triumph he had felt after his hike now seemed distant, a faint memory, overshadowed by the reality of his body's limitations. For the first time in weeks, he felt completely defeated. Was it even worth it? All the effort he had put in, all the dietary changes, the early morning stretches, the careful adjustments to his lifestyle, was it really enough to make a lasting difference? He had read all the articles, watched all the videos, and had listened to experts like Elon Musk, who claimed that taking charge of aging through small, simple choices was the key. But now, lying in bed, it seemed like nothing more than a fleeting hope, a mirage. In the silence of the room, Henry's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "How are you doing, Dad? Have you tried adding magnesium-rich foods yet? I really think you're on the right track, but it can take time." His mind flickered to Sarah. She was so optimistic, so certain that he was doing the right thing, that these small dietary changes would eventually lead to a real transformation. Her unwavering belief in him was comforting, but at that moment, Henry didn't know if he could keep pretending that everything was okay. He felt as though he was caught in an endless cycle of hope and disappointment, each step forward followed by a setback that reminded him of his age and his limitations. As he typed a response, his mind returned to the hike, to the exhilaration of reaching the summit. For a brief moment, he had felt like his old self again, the man who climbed mountains with no fear, who looked forward to the challenges life brought his way. But now, with the cramp still fresh in his memory, the summit seemed like a distant dream, a fleeting moment of triumph that had been swallowed by the harsh reality of aging. He could hear the hum of his phone vibrating on the nightstand, signaling another incoming message. But this time, it wasn't Sarah. It was a reminder from his fitness app, "Keep going. Consistency is key." He sighed deeply. There it was again, this relentless push for progress. No matter how many reminders he received, how many messages of encouragement were sent his way, the underlying truth remained. No amount of food, no amount of exercise, no amount of optimism could undo the inevitable. The thought of accepting this, of letting go of the hope that he could defy aging, that he could turn back the clock, was terrifying. And yet, it was the only option left. He had spent so many years trying to outrun time, but perhaps it was time to stop running and start embracing the journey. He wasn't the man he had been in his youth, and he likely never would be again. But that didn't mean he couldn't continue to live a full, meaningful life. Still, as he lay there in the darkness, the cramp lingering in his memory, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been chasing something impossible. The emotional weight of his own aging was more crushing than any physical pain he had ever endured. The battle, it seemed, was not just with his body, but with the very concept of what it meant to grow old. The next morning, after a restless night, Henry found himself standing in his kitchen, staring at the ingredients Sarah had suggested: bananas, spinach, salmon. Simple, unassuming foods. Could they really help him feel better? Or was he simply grasping at straws? He sat down at the table and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his messages, pausing when he saw one from his old friend, Dave, who had sent a picture of the summit they had reached just days earlier. "Made it to the top, Henry. You're stronger than you think." The words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about the physical strength. It was about the mental strength to continue, even when things felt impossible. To keep moving forward, even when the goal seemed just out of reach. As Henry stared at the photo of Dave, grinning triumphantly at the top of the mountain, a realization settled over him. Aging wasn't a fight to be won or lost. It was a process to be navigated. It wasn't about turning back time or erasing the signs of wear and tear, it was about finding strength in the journey itself. He wasn't going to give up on his health, on his ability to push through. But maybe it wasn't about expecting miracles. Maybe it was about accepting the moments of discomfort and celebrating the victories, no matter how small they seemed. His mind made up, he sent Sarah a message back: "I'm sticking with it. I think I've been focusing on the wrong things. It's not just about how fast I get better, but about how I keep moving forward, even when it's tough." And with that, something shifted inside Henry. The emotional burden he had been carrying, the fear of losing himself to age, began to lift, if only just a little. There was hope yet, even if it wasn't the kind of hope he had imagined. As he took a deep breath and turned back to the kitchen counter, he prepared his meal for the day, just a small step, but one that felt like progress. And for the first time in a while, it felt like the right kind of progress. The following days were filled with a new kind of quiet. Henry's cramp had been a rude awakening, but it was also a turning point. He still felt the sting of that night, the fear and frustration of not being in full control of his body, but something inside him had shifted. As he sat at the kitchen table the morning after his painful episode, he stared at the banana in front of him, a simple thing, really. A fruit. But as he held it, he thought back to the advice Sarah had given him, it's the small things that add up. He had been looking for a quick fix, something that would make everything right in an instant. But the reality was that the changes he needed were slow, steady, and above all, real. There was no magic food or pill that could erase the inevitable. Aging was a part of life, not an enemy to be defeated, but a phase to be understood and embraced. He peeled the banana slowly, its sweet aroma filling the air. The sun was coming through the window, casting warm light on the kitchen counter, and for the first time in a while, Henry felt a sense of peace. He wasn't back at square one. He had come so far. The cramps, though still an occasional obstacle, were becoming less frequent. He was moving with his body rather than fighting against it, and that, he realized, was the real victory. His morning routine had become a kind of ritual, a new way of honoring his body, rather than resenting it. The spinach, the salmon, the bananas, all of it had become more than just food. They were symbols of his willingness to change, of his commitment to pushing through the discomfort, of his desire to age gracefully. But it wasn't just about what he ate anymore. It was also about how he approached life. His daily walks in the park had become moments of mindfulness, where he could appreciate the simple beauty of the world around him. The sky, the trees, the sound of birds chirping, it was all there, a reminder that life, even in its most challenging moments, could still be full of joy. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, Henry found himself reflecting on his younger years, when he had been so consumed with achievement, with building a career, a life. He had often pushed his physical well-being aside, thinking that his mind and determination would carry him through. But now, with age slowly creeping up on him, he realized that life wasn't just about achieving, it was about experiencing, living fully, even when the body began to change. He saw a group of young joggers pass by, their legs moving effortlessly as they sped past him. A small part of him envied their energy, their ease. But as the thought passed, another followed, there where I once was, but I'm here, in this moment, with a different kind of strength. The strength he had now was one of resilience, of patience, of acceptance. His body wasn't what it once was, but it was still capable of so much. The ability to keep going, to keep showing up, to embrace the imperfections, that was his true strength now. Later that week, Henry had another call with Sarah. She had been asking for updates on his progress, eager to hear about the changes he had noticed. And as he sat on the couch, phone in hand, he found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he told her. "About how it's not just the food, but the mindset. I think I'm starting to get it. It's not about finding some perfect solution to make aging stop, it's about making peace with it and finding a new way forward." Sarah's voice was warm, full of encouragement. "I'm really proud of you, Dad. It sounds like you're really starting to find that balance." And in that moment, Henry realized that Sarah was right. The balance wasn't about achieving perfection or beating the clock, it was about finding peace with the process. There would still be difficult days, still moments of doubt and pain, but he had learned something crucial in his journey: aging didn't have to be a battle. It could be a journey of growth, of learning to adapt, to listen to his body, and to embrace the strength that comes with each passing year. The key, Henry now understood, was not to resist the natural course of life, but to engage with it fully, mind, body, and spirit. He would still have to face the reality of his body's limitations, but he could do so with a sense of gratitude for what it had carried him through, and for what it was still capable of achieving. The cramps would still come and go, but they no longer defined him. Aging would still happen, but it didn't have to mean giving up or surrendering. The goal was no longer to conquer aging, but to live with it. To move with it. As the days passed, Henry found himself stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where his health wasn't a fight against time, but a partnership with it. He learned to take things slower when he needed to rest when he felt tired, and to nourish his body with the foods that supported his health. He wasn't perfect, but that was okay. Perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was to continue moving forward, no matter how small the steps. In the end, Henry's journey wasn't about defeating aging. It was about understanding that aging wasn't something to fight against, but a natural part of life that deserved respect and acceptance. By learning to listen to his body, by making thoughtful choices, and by embracing each day with gratitude, Henry had discovered something far more valuable than any quick fix. He had found peace. Henry's routine had taken on a rhythm of its own now. He no longer woke up to a day filled with dread, but rather a sense of quiet anticipation. It was the kind of anticipation that comes with knowing you're moving in the right direction, even if the journey is slow and incremental. Each morning, he would start with a glass of water and then make a healthy breakfast, usually something simple, like oatmeal topped with fresh berries or a smoothie packed with greens. The cramping had become an occasional annoyance, but it no longer ruled his life. As the days passed, Henry's walks in the park became longer and more leisurely. What once felt like a chore now became a time for reflection. He'd think about his life, his family, his career, the friendships he'd formed along the way. He thought about the moments of pride and regret, the choices that had shaped him, and the ones he still had yet to make. But what stood out most to him was how much he had resisted change in the past. He had always been so focused on maintaining control, believing that if he just worked hard enough, he could defy the inevitable. But now, Henry understood something far deeper. Aging wasn't something to be fought against, it was a natural part of the journey, and learning to embrace it was where the true strength lay. One particular afternoon, as he walked along the familiar path through the park, Henry spotted a group of elderly men playing chess on a bench under a large oak tree. He had passed them countless times before, but today, something about them caught his eye. They were focused, their hands steady as they moved their pieces with care, their expressions calm and measured. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. They were present in the moment, fully absorbed in their game. The sight of them made Henry pause for a moment, reflecting on how they had mastered the art of aging with grace. He approached them with a smile. "Mind if I watch for a bit?" he asked, already knowing the answer. One of the men, a tall fellow with a long white beard, looked up and waved him over. "Of course, join us. It's not about winning, it's about enjoying the game." The words hit Henry like a quiet revelation. It's not about winning, it's about enjoying the game. He sat down on the bench, watching the chessboard. The men exchanged a few friendly jabs, teasing one another about their moves. But there was no bitterness in their words, just camaraderie and the shared joy of spending time together. The experience reminded Henry of his own journey. It wasn't about getting to the end of the game as fast as possible, it was about being present, about finding joy in the small moments along the way. He didn't need to outrun time or defy aging, he needed to make the most of every step, to appreciate the present rather than always striving for a future that was forever out of reach. As the game continued, Henry listened to the men talk about their lives. About the years they had lived, the challenges they had faced, and the lessons they had learned. They spoke with a sense of peace, an acceptance that only came with time. One of the men shared a story about his youth, when he had been a sailor, traveling the world. Another told a tale of raising his children and watching them grow into adults. They laughed, they reminisced, but more than anything, they seemed content. They weren't bitter about the years that had passed, but rather thankful for them. It was this gratitude that made their aging process seem so effortless. After a while, the game ended, and the men stood up to stretch. "Would you like to play tomorrow?" the white-bearded man asked Henry with a friendly smile. "I think I'd like that," Henry replied, surprised by how eager he was to return. He had always considered chess a game of intellect, something that required precision and strategy, but now he saw it in a new light. It wasn't just about outsmarting the opponent, it was about enjoying the interaction, the mental exercise, the camaraderie that came with it. That night, as Henry lay in bed, the day's events replayed in his mind. He thought about the elderly men in the park and the lesson they had unknowingly imparted. It wasn't about trying to prove something to others or to himself, it was about living fully in the moment. Aging wasn't something to fear or resist, it was an opportunity to enjoy the game of life at a different pace, to savor the small victories and to appreciate the simple moments that came with growing older. The next morning, as Henry prepared for his walk, he made a decision. He was going to stop trying to rush through life. He had spent too many years focused on productivity, achievement, and perfection. Now, it was time to focus on the process, the moments in between. Whether it was a chess game, a walk in the park, or a simple conversation with his children, he would embrace each experience fully. By the time he reached the park that afternoon, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the park was filled with the soft sounds of nature. Henry made his way to the bench where the men usually played, and to his delight, they were already there. "Ready for a game?" the white-bearded man asked. Henry smiled. "I think I am," he replied, settling in. As the game began, Henry felt something inside him shift. He was no longer in a rush to get to the end. He wasn't focused on winning. Instead, he was fully present, moving the pieces carefully, enjoying the rhythm of the game, the challenge of the moves, and the quiet camaraderie that had already begun to form between him and these strangers-turned-friends. This was his new perspective. Life wasn't a race to be won, but a game to be played with purpose, patience, and a deep sense of gratitude for each moment. As he made his move, Henry realized that aging wasn't about avoiding the inevitable, it was about navigating it with grace and intention. The game of life was something to be cherished, and he was learning to play it in a way that made each moment matter. As the weeks passed, Henry's life began to settle into a new rhythm. His walks in the park had become a daily ritual, his meals were more thoughtfully prepared, and his approach to aging had shifted from frustration to acceptance. But there was still one thing lingering in the back of his mind: he needed to do more. The changes he had made in his diet, the habits he had started to embrace, were all beneficial, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had gotten used to managing the cramps, but he still sometimes found himself holding back. He wasn't living as fully as he could. The quiet walks were grounding, the healthy meals were nourishing, but something inside him urged him to push further. He needed to rediscover a sense of purpose, to prove to himself that he wasn't ready to slow down just yet. One morning, after finishing his usual routine, he sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and stared out the window. The sun was already high in the sky, casting golden beams over the quiet neighborhood. He thought about the men he'd met in the park, the chess players who had embraced life at their own pace. But even as he admired their calm demeanor, he realized that he couldn't simply live passively. He still needed to challenge himself, find something that would reignite the fire inside. That's when the idea hit him. A challenge. Something physical, but not just about the body. Something that would also engage his mind and his heart. Henry had always loved hiking. It was something he had done sporadically over the years, but now it felt like the perfect opportunity to take on a new challenge. A long, difficult hike through the nearby mountains. The idea excited him, but it also scared him. Could he really do it? Would his body hold up? The next few days were filled with preparation. Henry started by researching nearby hiking trails, gathering the necessary gear, and speaking with a few friends who were avid hikers. One of them, Jim, was an experienced mountaineer who had hiked all over the world. Jim was enthusiastic when Henry brought up the idea. "You're never too old to hike, Henry," he said with a grin. "It's all about pacing yourself and knowing when to take a break. I'll be happy to guide you through it." Henry spent the next week getting ready. He made sure to continue his morning walks, increasing his distance each day, and focused on eating the right foods to fuel his body. He even started incorporating some stretches and light strength exercises to improve his endurance. But despite the preparation, a little voice in the back of his head continued to question whether he was really up for it. He had always prided himself on being strong, but this was different. The mountains represented something bigger than just a physical challenge. It was about confronting his fears, pushing himself beyond his comfort zone, and proving that age didn't have to limit him. The morning of the hike, Henry felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Jim picked him up early, their packs loaded with water, snacks, and gear. They drove out of the city, the air growing fresher with each mile. The mountains loomed in the distance, majestic and intimidating. As they reached the trailhead, Henry felt a knot form in his stomach. There was no turning back now. "Ready for this?" Jim asked, looking over at him with a grin. Henry nodded, though his heart was racing. "Let's do it." The first part of the hike was deceptively easy. The trail was wide, the terrain relatively flat, and they moved at a comfortable pace. Jim kept the conversation light, pointing out interesting plants and animals along the way. But as the trail began to rise, Henry felt his body start to protest. His legs were sore, his breathing heavier, and he could feel the weight of his pack pressing down on him. "You're doing great," Jim encouraged him, noticing his labored breath. "Just take it slow, Henry. No rush. We've got all the time in the world." That was the key, Henry realized, taking it slow. The urgency he had always felt to rush through life, to finish tasks as quickly as possible, wasn't necessary here. It was about the journey, not the destination. He had spent so many years pushing himself, competing against time, that he had forgotten how to simply enjoy the process. The hike, despite being physically challenging, was a reminder to pace himself, to listen to his body, and to stay present. As the day wore on, the trail grew steeper and more challenging. Henry's legs were burning, his body begging for rest. But he kept going, step by step, focusing on the rhythm of his breath and the sounds of nature around him. The further they climbed, the more rewarding it felt. The views became more breathtaking, the air crisper, and the sense of accomplishment grew with each step. After several hours, they finally reached the summit. Henry stood there, gazing out at the vast landscape below him. The mountains stretched on for miles, their peaks covered in a dusting of snow, and the valley beneath was bathed in golden light. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool, thin air fill his lungs, and a sense of triumph washed over him. "I made it," he whispered to himself, as much in disbelief as in pride. He had done it. The climb had been difficult, but in many ways, it had been exactly what he needed. It wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about proving to himself that he was still capable of more, still able to take on new challenges and push beyond the limits he had once set for himself. Jim sat down next to him, pulling out a water bottle. "You did it, Henry. How do you feel?" Henry looked out at the horizon, his mind clear, his body exhausted but satisfied. "I feel alive," he said, the words coming from a place deep within him. "I feel like I've still got a lot more to give." As they sat there, taking in the view, Henry realized that this hike wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental one as well. It was about confronting his fears, accepting his limitations, and finding strength in the face of them. He had spent so many years fighting aging, resisting the changes in his body, but now he had found a new way to face the passage of time, not with fear, but with courage and resilience. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the quiet hum of nature. Henry had made it to the summit, but the journey had taken more out of him than he anticipated. His legs were sore, his muscles tired, and his mind was working overtime as he sat on a large rock, staring out at the sprawling view of the valley below. He had done it, he had completed the hike, a physical feat he hadn't believed possible only weeks ago. But as he sat there, the high of accomplishment began to wane. There was a strange heaviness in his chest, a feeling that he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, it was something deeper. Something that had been building inside him ever since he had made the decision to take on the hike. A nagging doubt, a voice in his head whispering that perhaps he wasn't really changing. "You're doing great, Henry." "Really," Jim said, breaking his thoughts as he sat beside him, his voice light, encouraging. But Henry couldn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long, steady breath, trying to push the nagging feeling away. He had proved something to himself, hadn't he? He had taken on this challenge, pushed his body beyond its limits, and made it to the top. Yet, as much as he wanted to bask in that success, something about the effort felt hollow. He wanted more. "I don't know, Jim," Henry finally said, his voice carrying the weight of his confusion. "I thought this would feel different. I thought I'd feel more accomplished. But now that I'm here, I feel like I'm still missing something." Jim chuckled, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "You're a tough guy to please, Henry. Most people would be celebrating after doing what you just did." Henry smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I guess I'm just not sure what comes next. I've been changing my routine, trying to face my fears, but I feel like there's still something that I'm holding back from really embracing." Jim glanced at him with a look of understanding, his tone softer now. "You know, change doesn't always happen in big moments. Sometimes it's about the little things. Like the fact that you're here, pushing yourself. That's more than most people ever do." "I don't know," Henry muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "I still feel like I'm trying to outrun something. Maybe it's not just about facing physical challenges. Maybe it's about facing myself, about really letting go of the old version of me." Jim leaned forward, his gaze steady and calm. "That's the hardest part, Henry. Letting go. We all hold on to things, old habits, fears, regrets. But the truth is, you've already taken a huge step. You came up here, didn't you? That shows you're willing to change." But even as Jim spoke those words, Henry wasn't entirely convinced. His mind kept circling back to his doubts. He had changed, he had faced the physical challenge, tackled the hike, embraced the idea of aging in a new light. But there was something in him that still felt like he was holding back. Something that made him feel like no matter what he achieved, he couldn't truly move forward until he could face this part of himself. It was late afternoon when they finally made their way down the mountain. The descent was quicker, but it felt like an eternity to Henry. His thoughts swirled like the wind around him, restless, unsure. By the time they returned to the car, the sun was low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The journey back felt heavy, not just with the physical toll of the hike, but with the weight of his own uncertainty. He had achieved something monumental, yet it still didn't feel like enough. His heart was still heavy, his mind still uncertain. As Jim drove him back to his house, the silence in the car was palpable. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had done all the right things, he had exercised, changed his diet, embraced a new routine, but something deep inside him still felt incomplete. The ache was subtle but persistent, like a low hum that wouldn't go away. When they reached his driveway, Henry turned to Jim. "Thanks for everything today, Jim. Really. I don't know if I would have made it without you." Jim smiled, but his eyes held a deeper understanding. "Anytime, Henry. You know where to find me if you need another challenge. Or just someone to talk to." "Maybe I will," Henry said quietly. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't stop here. The journey was far from over. It wasn't just about pushing his body, but about pushing his soul. As Henry walked up to his front door, he felt the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He had conquered the mountain, but now he needed to conquer himself. That night, as he lay in bed, his body aching from the hike but his mind still racing, he realized something. All of his life, he had been running from change, resisting the inevitable. But now that he had started down this path of transformation, he couldn't stop. He had to face his fears, his fear of aging, his fear of letting go of the past, and allow himself to fully embrace who he was becoming. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Henry understood that the true test was not in the mountain he had just climbed, but in the mountain still ahead. It was time to face himself, to break through the barriers he had built around his heart. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest, not just physically, but mentally. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. But tonight, he would simply breathe. Henry woke up the next morning to the soft light filtering through the blinds. His body ached from the hike, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that lingered. No, it was something deeper. A feeling that had taken root in his chest the night before, a whisper in his mind that wouldn't let go. He lay there for a few moments, letting the quiet of the morning surround him. The soft hum of the city waking up outside, the faint sounds of birds in the distance. It all felt peaceful, but Henry knew he couldn't keep ignoring the truth that had been building inside him. The physical challenge of the hike had been just the beginning. As much as it had pushed him beyond his limits, it had also revealed something about himself that he couldn't ignore. He had spent so many years running away from his fears, from the reality of aging, and from the idea of letting go of his past. But it wasn't enough anymore to simply push through and pretend he was fine. He needed to face it head-on. The question was, how? He got out of bed, his joints protesting with each movement. The cramps hadn't returned in full force, but he could still feel their shadow lingering, like a constant reminder that his body was no longer as it had been. There were moments when he felt like an old man, like the weight of time was pressing down on him. But then there were moments, like after the hike, when he felt a flicker of the person he used to be. He glanced at the clock. It was early enough that he could take some time for himself before the day got too busy. He decided to make breakfast, a routine he had come to enjoy. The process of chopping vegetables, sautéing them in olive oil, and cracking eggs into the pan had become meditative, a way for him to focus his mind and center himself for the day ahead. As the smell of onions and garlic filled the kitchen, Henry's thoughts turned inward. What was it he was truly running from? Was it simply aging? Or was it the fear of no longer being relevant? Of losing his identity as someone who was active, engaged, and vital? He thought about his family, his children, his wife, how they had always been there for him, but they had also moved on with their own lives. His children were grown, their own careers and families taking center stage. His wife, Emma, had always been his rock, but he knew she too had started to shift her focus. They had entered a phase of life where independence was more of a reality than they had ever imagined. The realization hit him hard. He had to find a new way to relate to the world around him. He couldn't hold on to his past as a way to define who he was now. He had to redefine himself, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. Just as he was finishing his breakfast, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jim. "How are you feeling today, Henry? You were amazing out there yesterday." Henry smiled as he read the message, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend. Jim had been more than just a hiking companion. He had been a guide, a reminder that change wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. "I'm feeling good. Still processing everything, but it was worth it. Thanks for being there." The reply came quickly, "You're welcome. Keep pushing yourself, Henry. You're stronger than you think." As Henry put down his phone, he realized that Jim was right. The hike had proven he was stronger than he thought. But more than that, it had shown him that strength didn't just come from physical feats, it came from the willingness to face your own limitations and keep moving forward, despite them. He finished his breakfast and decided that he would spend the day reflecting. It was time to really understand what was happening inside of him. He didn't want to let this feeling of uncertainty control him. He needed clarity. He needed to confront the mirror. Later that afternoon, Henry found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror. For a long time, he had avoided truly looking at himself. His reflection, though familiar, felt different these days. The lines on his face were deeper, his hair graying more rapidly, and his eyes, though still sharp, seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. He stared at his reflection, almost as if expecting it to give him some answer, to tell him what to do next. But all he saw was the man he had been, and the man he was becoming. There was no magic answer. No sudden revelation. But there was something in the stillness of the moment. A recognition. "I'm still here," he said softly, as though speaking to himself for the first time in a long while. "I'm still here, and I'm not finished yet." The words felt strange but empowering. He wasn't finished. He wasn't done. Aging didn't mean disappearing. It didn't mean becoming irrelevant. It meant evolving, adapting, and finding new purpose. And if he was honest with himself, that scared him. The idea of embracing a new version of himself, one that wasn't bound by the limitations he had once imposed, was both terrifying and exhilarating. The reflection staring back at him seemed to soften, the lines around his eyes deepening in a way that spoke of years of laughter, love, and hardship. He wasn't just seeing an old man. He was seeing a man who had lived, who had loved, who had faced challenges, and who had learned to keep going despite them. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to keep living. To keep pushing forward. To keep learning. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. That evening, Henry sat down at his desk with a pen and notebook. For the first time in weeks, he felt a surge of inspiration. He began to write, not about the past or the mountain he had climbed, but about the future. About what came next. He wrote about the possibility of new beginnings, of rethinking what it meant to grow older. He wrote about the challenges he had faced, and the ones still to come. And at the top of the page, he wrote, "This is only the beginning." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few weeks passed by in a blur for Henry. The physical ache of the hike faded, but the mental and emotional transformation that had begun during his time on the mountain lingered, occupying more of his thoughts than he cared to admit. It wasn't just about getting older anymore, it was about how he could shape his future. His body might be aging, but his mind, his spirit, they still had room to grow. Every morning, after his usual breakfast of eggs and sautéed vegetables, Henry made time for reflection. He started to journal regularly, not just about the physical changes he had been experiencing, but about the feelings he had suppressed for so long. He wrote about the doubts, the fears, the insecurities, everything he had been afraid to confront. And then, slowly but surely, he started writing about hope. Hope wasn't something that came easily for Henry. He had lived much of his life believing that strength came from holding on tightly, never letting go. But now, he realized, true strength was found in letting go, of expectations, of rigid identities, of the fear of what was to come. In the midst of all this, his relationship with Emma began to evolve as well. She noticed the change in him, the way he seemed more present, more engaged, more open to conversation. He wasn't the same man who had withdrawn into himself in the years leading up to his 60s. Henry had always been a man of action, but now he was also a man of reflection, of deep thinking. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sunset, Emma spoke up. "You've been different lately," she said, her tone gentle but inquisitive. "More peaceful, maybe. I don't know, but there's something about you that's changed." Henry chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on the vibrant sky as it shifted from orange to purple. "I've been thinking a lot," he admitted. "About life, about getting older. About the things I've been holding on to for too long." Emma looked at him, her eyes softening. "I've noticed," she said quietly. "And I'm glad. I know it's not easy to confront some of the things you've been avoiding. Henry nodded, the words feeling heavy but freeing. It hasn't been easy. But I feel like I'm finally ready to let go. Let go of the past, the fear, the way I've been so hard on myself. Emma reached over, placing her hand gently on his. I think you've always been ready, Henry. You just needed to find the courage to embrace it. Her words, simple yet profound, struck a chord within him. Emma had always known him better than anyone else. She had seen the struggles he kept hidden, the ways he struggled to reconcile his past with his present. But now, as she sat beside him, Henry realized that she had been right all along. The courage to change was within him all along. He just needed to stop being afraid of it. As the weeks turned into months, Henry found that his transformation wasn't just internal, it started to ripple outward. The changes he was making within himself began to influence his interactions with others, especially his children. He reached out to his son, Caleb, who had been busy with his own family life. They hadn't spoken as much as they used to, and Henry realized he had allowed that distance to grow. One Sunday afternoon, Henry picked up the phone and dialed Caleb's number. "Hey, Dad," Caleb answered on the second ring. "How's it going?" "Good, good," Henry replied, his voice steady but warm. "I've been meaning to call. I wanted to catch up with you." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft chuckle from Caleb. "Yeah, it's been a while, huh?" Henry smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "It has. I guess I've been distracted. But I've been thinking a lot about what's important lately, and I realized I don't want to let more time slip by without making an effort." "Dad, I get it," Caleb said, his voice warmer now. "You know, I've been feeling the same way. Work, the kids, everything's been so busy. But I miss just talking." "I miss it too," Henry replied. "Maybe we can get together sometime soon. Just hang out. Talk." "Yeah, let's do that," Caleb agreed, sounding genuinely excited. "How about next weekend? We can grab a drink and catch up like old times." Henry's heart swelled with gratitude. This was the kind of connection he had been missing, the kind he hadn't realized was so important until now. The change he was making inside himself was beginning to have an impact on his relationships. He wasn't just reconnecting with his son, he was reconnecting with a version of himself that he had lost touch with. That weekend, Henry met Caleb at a local pub. The conversation flowed easily, as if no time had passed at all. They talked about everything, work, family, old memories, and even shared a few laughs. But what stood out most to Henry was the way Caleb seemed to listen to him differently now. It wasn't just about fatherly advice or guidance, it was about real conversation, two men who had lived and learned and were willing to open up to one another. As they said their goodbyes later that night, Henry felt lighter. It wasn't just about the hike anymore, it was about the relationships he had, the people he loved, and the way he could begin to reforge those connections by simply showing up, being present, and embracing who he was. Back at home, Henry sat down at his desk, reflecting on the evening. He realized that the ripple effect of his transformation wasn't just changing his own life, it was affecting everyone around him. By facing his fears and embracing the changes he had been avoiding for so long, he was not only healing himself but opening doors for others to heal as well. He thought back to the hike, to the moment when he had stood at the summit, feeling both triumphant and uncertain. What he hadn't realized at the time was that the journey didn't end at the top of the mountain. It continued long after the hike, in the relationships he nurtured, the habits he created, and the way he saw himself in the world. The ripple was just beginning. Henry's world had shifted significantly in the past few months. He had begun to embrace the changes that came with aging, and the people around him were noticing it. The conversations with his children were becoming more meaningful, his relationship with Emma had deepened, and even his work life felt different. But just when he thought things were settling into a new normal, something unexpected happened. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when the doorbell rang. Henry had just come back from his morning jog, still feeling the rush of endorphins that came with pushing himself harder than usual. He had been waking up earlier lately, trying to make the most of each day. He was learning that time, once something he had always taken for granted, was now a precious commodity. Emma, who had been working in the study, stood up when she heard the bell. "I'll get it," she said, walking toward the door. Henry didn't think much of it at first. They weren't expecting anyone, but it wasn't unusual for friends or neighbors to drop by. But when Emma opened the door, Henry heard her sharp intake of breath from across the room. "Emma?" Henry called, concern creeping into his voice. He quickly wiped his hands on his workout shorts and stood up. "Who is it?" He stepped toward the door, and when he saw who was standing on the porch, his heart skipped a beat. Standing there, drenched from the rain, was his younger brother, Nathan. Nathan, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. "Nathan?" Henry breathed, his voice shaky with disbelief. "Is that really you?" Nathan smiled, a tired but genuine grin that seemed to soften the years between them. His face was more weathered than Henry remembered, and his hair had grayed in the way only time could do to someone who had lived hard. But there was still that familiar spark in his eyes. The brother he had known all those years ago was standing in front of him, and for a moment, the years melted away. "I know this is a surprise," Nathan said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't used it much lately. "But I thought I'd stop by." Emma stepped back, allowing Nathan to enter, but Henry was still frozen at the doorway. His mind raced, trying to piece together the last time he'd seen Nathan. They had been close once, but life, busy with their own families, careers, and separate paths, had pulled them apart. The last time they spoke, it had been a brief, somewhat awkward phone call. Nathan had been living in another state, and Henry had moved on with his life. They'd drifted, each of them in their own world. Come in," Emma said, ushering Nathan into the living room. "You must be freezing. Let me get you a towel." As Nathan stepped inside, Henry snapped out of his daze and followed, the weight of the moment settling over him. He watched as Emma made her way to the kitchen, but Henry stayed by the door, still unsure of what to say. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Henry nodded slowly. "Too long," he admitted, his voice betraying the weight of the lost years. Nathan looked at him, his eyes searching Henry's face as if he was trying to read the man he had once known so well. "I've been thinking about the past a lot lately. A lot about you, actually. About us." Henry frowned, a tightness forming in his chest. He had spent so many years pushing away the past, his relationship with Nathan was one of those things he had buried deep. They had once been inseparable, but somewhere along the line, things had changed. He hadn't been able to forgive Nathan for leaving him behind when life had gotten complicated. He hadn't understood why his brother had distanced himself, but now, seeing him here, standing in his living room, Henry was filled with a mix of emotions. Anger, confusion, and, surprisingly, relief. "I've missed you," Henry said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He hadn't realized how much he had missed his brother until now. Nathan gave a small laugh, almost in disbelief. "I know. I've missed you too. That's why I'm here." Emma came back into the room, handing Nathan a towel and a warm mug of tea. "We're so glad you came, Nathan," she said warmly, giving him a gentle hug. "You're always welcome here." Henry sat down across from Nathan, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions in his chest. The surprise of Nathan's arrival was overwhelming, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a casual visit. There was something deeper at play. "So, what brings you here?" Henry asked, his voice calmer now, but still uncertain. "It's been years, and you never really kept in touch." Nathan's face softened, and he looked down at the mug in his hands. "I know I've been distant, Henry. But I've been carrying a lot of guilt. I didn't make the right choices when it came to family, when it came to you." And I've been dealing with some things in my own life that I couldn't run away from anymore. I realized I needed to make amends. Henry's heart twisted. The guilt, the unspoken things between them, the years of silence, it was all coming to light now. He had always assumed Nathan had simply forgotten about him, that he had been left behind. But now, hearing his brother speak so honestly, Henry realized how wrong he had been. Life, it has a way of getting in the way, Nathan continued. But I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. About what I did wrong. And about how I want to fix things. I don't want to keep running away from what's right in front of me anymore. Henry's throat tightened. There it was. The moment he had longed for, the opportunity to reconnect with the brother he had lost all those years ago. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be hurt to process, forgiveness to work through, but Henry could feel the weight of the moment settling in. I'm glad you came, Nathan, Henry said softly. It's going to take time, but we'll figure this out. Together. Nathan nodded, his eyes glistening. I hope so. That night, after Nathan had settled in and Emma had made a meal, the three of them sat at the dining table, sharing stories, laughing, and talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in that moment, Henry realized something: sometimes the most unexpected visitors had the power to change everything. They could bring with them the possibility of healing, of reconciliation, and of finding the courage to face the past and move forward. As the evening wore on, Henry couldn't help but feel that this was another step on his journey, one that, much like his hike, would challenge him but ultimately lead to growth. The weeks following Nathan's sudden return were a whirlwind of emotions for Henry. What had started as a brief visit turned into something much deeper, much more intricate. Nathan, who had been absent from Henry's life for more than 2 decades, was now staying with them, sharing meals, stories, and even painful silences that spoke volumes. They had long, honest conversations about everything, from their childhood memories to the missteps of their adult lives. But something about Nathan's presence still didn't sit entirely right with Henry. He had never been the type to shy away from the truth, yet something in Nathan's story didn't fully add up. Henry couldn't place it at first, but there was a nagging feeling, a hunch that there was more to Nathan's return than he was letting on. It wasn't until late one evening, as Henry sat alone in the living room, that he finally decided to confront his brother. Emma was upstairs, finishing up a project for work, and Nathan had gone out for a walk in the neighborhood. Henry hadn't planned on waiting up for him, but when he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the porch, he knew it was time. He opened the door and stepped out, finding Nathan standing under the dim porch light, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. The rain had stopped, but the night air was cold, crisp. Can we talk? Henry's voice was steady but firm. Nathan turned to look at him, and for a brief moment, Henry saw the same uncertainty in his brother's eyes, the same vulnerability that had been there when he first arrived. Nathan nodded, his expression unreadable. Sure, Henry. What's on your mind? Henry's gaze hardened slightly, the resolve in him strengthening. You know, I've been thinking a lot about why you came back. About what you said, the stuff about making amends, about how you've been carrying around guilt. But something doesn't sit right with me. I need to know the whole story, Nathan. Why are you really here? Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to the ground before meeting Henry's once more. I told you the truth, he said quietly. I've been through a lot. But there's more to it. There's stuff I haven't told you. Stuff that I should have told you years ago. Henry's chest tightened. His instincts had been right. There was something deeper, something unspoken hanging between them. He stepped closer, his tone urgent. Then it's time you told me, Nathan. I deserve to know. What aren't you telling me? Nathan hesitated for a long moment. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if considering how much he was willing to reveal. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. The reason I left, the reason I disappeared wasn't just because of my own issues. It wasn't just about me running from responsibilities or avoiding family. He paused, his eyes darkening. It was about something I was involved in. Something that put us both at risk. Henry's mind raced. What do you mean? What did you do? Nathan looked down, his expression pained. I got mixed up with the wrong people. It was a few years after you and I drifted apart. I was working in the city, and I got involved in some shady business. Nothing big, just enough to get me in trouble. Enough to make me want to cut ties with everyone I knew. Including you. Henry's stomach churned as he processed his brother's words. His mind flashed to all the years he had spent resenting Nathan for abandoning him, not knowing the real reason why. The betrayal was raw, but it also explained a lot: the secrecy, the sudden silence, the disappearance without so much as a goodbye. And you thought the only way to protect me was to cut me off. Henry's voice was thick with emotion. You thought that disappearing without a word was better than telling me what was really going on. Nathan's eyes met his, and for the first time since his arrival, there was no defensiveness in his gaze, only sorrow. I was trying to protect you, Henry. I thought if I stayed away, you wouldn't get dragged into the mess I was in. I didn't want you to suffer because of my mistakes. But I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have been honest with you from the start. The revelation hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Henry felt his heart beat faster, a mixture of anger and sadness roiling inside him. All these years of silence, all the pain, had come from a place of misguided protection. Why didn't you come back sooner? Why wait all these years? Henry's voice was low, the hurt seeping through. Nathan looked away, his jaw tightening. I tried to get my life together. But I was ashamed of what I had done, of the mess I had created. I thought I could fix things on my own. But the more time passed, the harder it became to face you. I couldn't bring myself to reach out until it was almost too late. Henry shook his head, the weight of it all sinking in. And now? Now you think you can just waltz back into my life like nothing happened? Nathan stepped forward, his hands outstretched as if trying to bridge the gap between them. No, Henry, that's not what I want. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I've lost years with you, with the family. But I'm here now. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm not going anywhere. I want to rebuild what we had. If you'll let me. There was a long silence. Henry stared at his brother, his mind overwhelmed with the gravity of everything he had just heard. He thought about the years they had lost, the things Nathan had hidden from him, and the trust that had been shattered. But as he looked into Nathan's eyes, he also saw something else. Regret. Sincerity. A willingness to change, to make things right, no matter how difficult the path would be. Henry took a deep breath, his chest heavy with conflicting emotions. He had spent so many years trying to protect himself from this very moment, trying to avoid the truth, trying to hold on to the past. But now, with everything laid bare, he realized that the only way forward was to confront it. Okay, Henry said, his voice steady but resolute. Let's take it one step at a time. But you need to know, Nathan, this isn't going to be easy. Trust isn't built overnight. Nathan nodded, his face softening with relief. I understand, Henry. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in years, Henry felt a small spark of hope ignite deep inside him. Rebuilding his relationship with Nathan wouldn't be easy, and there would be hard work ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he believed it was possible. As the two brothers stood in the quiet of the night, Henry realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward healing. It would take time, effort, and patience, but it was the beginning of something new. The days following their conversation had been a quiet storm for Henry. The revelation of Nathan's past, the years of silence, the shattered trust, everything was swirling in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. On one hand, he could understand why Nathan had kept his distance. On the other hand, the anger and hurt ran deep, like old wounds that had never fully healed. Nathan had spent the next few days staying at the house, respecting Henry's need for space but also doing his best to prove that he was sincere. Every morning, he'd make coffee and quietly join Henry on the porch for a few minutes of calm, as if trying to slowly reintegrate himself into the life he had abandoned. It was a delicate balance, one that Henry was struggling to navigate. But despite everything, something inside Henry began to shift. He couldn't erase the years of hurt, but he also couldn't keep holding on to the past. Emma, ever the peacemaker, had been supportive of both of them, offering gentle advice when it was needed and creating a peaceful home environment for Nathan's return. But even she knew that it would take time for both Henry and Nathan to find their footing again. It was the following Saturday afternoon when Henry decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He had been feeling restless and needed to clear his head. Nathan had gone out to run some errands, and Emma had a meeting scheduled for work. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to get some time alone. As Henry walked down the familiar streets, the cool breeze tousling his graying hair, he reflected on his life. He'd always been someone who prided himself on working hard and maintaining control over his world. But now, he realized, there were things beyond his control, things like time, relationships, and the decisions that others made that impacted his life. He had learned to accept the inevitability of aging, but forgiving the past, letting go of resentment, was something much more challenging. His walk took him to the old park where he used to take his children when they were younger. He had memories of swinging them high into the air, of teaching them how to ride bikes, of laughing with them under the shade of the large oak trees. The park hadn't changed much, but it felt different now, emptier somehow. It was as though the past had lingered there, hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. Henry sat down on one of the benches, closing his eyes for a moment. The sounds of children playing in the distance, the chirping of birds, the rustling of the leaves, it all reminded him of the importance of the present moment. He couldn't keep living in the past, no matter how painful it had been. He needed to let go, to allow himself the chance to heal and rebuild what was broken. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned, surprised to see Nathan walking toward him, his hands in his pockets, a hesitant look on his face. "Mind if I join you?" Nathan asked, his voice a little unsure. Henry smiled faintly and motioned to the empty space beside him. "Of course. Have a seat." Nathan sat down beside him, his body language tense, as if he was waiting for something, a sign, maybe, that Henry was ready to move forward. They sat in silence for a few moments, just watching the park around them. Finally, Henry broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice steady. "About everything." Nathan turned to look at him, his expression attentive. "And? I'm not going to lie," Henry continued, the words coming slowly, as if weighing each one carefully. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. You left me. You shut me out without explanation, and that was hard to deal with." Nathan nodded, his face etched with remorse. "I know, Henry. I can't change what I did, but I can say that I'm sorry. From the bottom of my heart. I never meant to hurt you." Henry looked at his brother, really looked at him. For the first time since their reunion, he saw the vulnerability in Nathan's eyes. The shame, the regret, the recognition that things couldn't simply be fixed with an apology. Nathan had always been the younger brother, the one who had looked up to him. Now, it felt as if they were both trying to find their way back to each other, each of them carrying their own burdens, their own pain. "I'm trying, Nathan," Henry said quietly. "But it's going to take time. It's not something that happens overnight." Nathan looked down, nodding. "I understand. I'm not expecting everything to be fixed in a day. I know I've got a lot to prove." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after an important, raw conversation, when both people are simply letting the weight of their words settle in. Henry exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his body start to ease. I don't know what the future holds, Nathan. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe we just need to take things one step at a time. Maybe it's not about fixing everything but about trying to rebuild from where we are now. Nathan's voice was soft, almost a whisper. I'll take whatever you can give, Henry. I just want a chance to make things right. Henry nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope rising in him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he could fully forgive Nathan yet, but he also knew that holding on to the past, clinging to resentment, was only holding him back. I'll give you that chance, Henry said, the words feeling both heavy and freeing. But it's going to be a slow process. And I need you to understand that. Nathan smiled faintly, relief flooding his features. I'll wait as long as it takes. For the first time since their conversation that night, Henry felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a big, dramatic shift, but it was enough. Enough for him to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild their relationship, one small step at a time. As the two brothers sat in the park, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, Henry felt something within him begin to shift. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, and it wasn't something that happened in a single conversation. But it was a process, a journey. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to take that step. The days after their heart-to-heart in the park were quiet, almost too quiet. Henry had given Nathan a second chance, but it felt like they were both walking on eggshells, trying to rebuild trust while not fully understanding how to do so. They spoke when necessary, but the weight of the unsaid things still lingered in the air like a thick fog. Henry tried to keep his mind busy, focusing on his work and everyday tasks. Emma had become the bridge between them, keeping the peace with gentle nudges and offering a listening ear when either of them needed it. But it was clear that neither brother had fully come to terms with the years of estrangement. The wounds were still raw, and the healing process was slow. It wasn't until one particular evening, about a week after their conversation, that Henry felt the first real shift. He was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, when Nathan wandered in. Henry had been chopping vegetables for a simple stew, the comforting scent of garlic and herbs filling the air. You know, Nathan began, standing by the counter with his hands in his pockets, his usual guarded expression softened by the dim kitchen light, I've been thinking about Dad. The mention of their father caught Henry off guard. Their relationship with their father had always been complicated, filled with tension and unspoken resentment. Their father had been a strict, demanding man, someone who had placed high expectations on both of them, but especially on Nathan. Henry had always felt that his younger brother bore the brunt of their father's harshness. Dad? Henry repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. It had been years since he had allowed himself to think about the man. What about him? Nathan's eyes grew distant, and he sat down on one of the stools at the counter, his gaze fixed on something beyond the kitchen window. I never really told you this, Henry, but, after I left, I thought about him a lot. I thought about how I couldn't live up to his expectations. And I think that's one of the reasons I pushed everyone away, especially you. I didn't want to be that disappointment anymore. Henry paused, his knife hovering over the cutting board. He didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he had felt the same way about their father. But hearing Nathan admit it was something different. It was as if a dam had broken, and the years of suppressed emotions were finally coming to the surface. Why didn't you say something sooner? Henry asked quietly, putting the knife down. Why didn't you ever talk to me about it? Nathan shrugged, looking uncomfortable. I thought I could handle it on my own. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. You had your own life, your own family. I guess I was afraid of disappointing you too, in a different way. I figured if I just left, you'd be better off without me. Henry felt a pang in his chest. He could see now how much Nathan had carried alone all these years. The weight of their father's expectations, the shame of not being able to measure up, and the pain of being left to navigate it all without any support. Henry had his own struggles with their father, but he had never realized how deeply it had affected Nathan. "I wish you had come to me, Nathan," Henry said softly. "I wish you had trusted me with that. We could have figured it out together." Nathan met his gaze then, his eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude. "I know. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for everything, Henry. I should have been a better brother. I should have been there." The conversation shifted after that. They didn't need to fill every silence with words, it was enough that they were finally acknowledging the things that had haunted them both for so long. Nathan had confessed something painful, something that explained so much about his choices, and Henry realized that, just like him, his brother had been carrying the scars of their father's harshness. The stew simmered on the stove, the scent filling the room as they stood together in the kitchen, two brothers who had lived through similar pain but had never shared it. It was a step, just one small step, but it felt like progress. Later that evening, as they sat down to eat together, the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The strained silence that had filled the house for so many years seemed to have lessened, replaced by an understanding that they had both been broken in different ways. The bond between them wasn't healed yet, but it was beginning to form in ways Henry hadn't expected. The next few days passed in a haze of small, meaningful moments. Nathan had started helping out more around the house, making an effort to contribute in ways he hadn't before. They had dinner together nearly every night, and though the conversations were still tentative at times, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that things were changing. But even as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, there were still reminders of the past, of what had been lost, of the years that couldn't be reclaimed. Henry caught himself looking at Nathan sometimes, wondering if it was really possible to undo the damage, to rebuild a relationship that had been broken for so long. It wasn't until one night, when Nathan came to him with a question that had been gnawing at him, that Henry truly understood how much his brother had changed. "I've been thinking," Nathan said, standing in the doorway of the living room where Henry sat reading. "About what you said, back at the park. About us taking it one step at a time. I know it's going to take a while, but, if I'm being honest, I'm kind of afraid that one day you'll just be done with me." Henry put the book down, his heart sinking slightly at the vulnerability in Nathan's voice. He had known that Nathan carried a lot of fear, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "I'm not going to walk away, Nathan," Henry replied, his voice firm. "I'm not going to leave you again. We may not have a perfect relationship, but I'm here. And I'm willing to work on it, even if it takes time. But you need to be here too. We both do." Nathan nodded, his eyes bright with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I will. I promise." For the first time in a long time, Henry felt a glimmer of hope, a real one. It wasn't a promise of perfection, and it certainly wasn't a guarantee that everything would be smooth from here on out. But it was something. It was progress. And for Henry, that was enough, for now. The months that followed seemed like a blur for both Henry and Nathan. They had settled into a rhythm, one that was less tense than before but still full of uncertainty. The house, which had once felt like a place of painful memories and unspoken resentment, was beginning to feel more like a home again. Though, of course, the journey to that point was neither simple nor fast. Nathan had found a job, something that gave him a sense of purpose and a way to contribute to the household. It wasn't the most glamorous work, he was helping out at a local hardware store, but it was enough to keep him busy and give him a sense of pride. Emma had been nothing but supportive, her calm presence a steady anchor for both brothers as they navigated their fragile new reality. But despite the progress, there were still moments when the past would creep back into their conversations, lurking in the corners of their interactions. Henry would catch himself remembering the old wounds, the years of silence, and the things that had gone unsaid. And Nathan, too, seemed to carry an invisible weight, one that wasn't always visible but could be felt when he looked away too quickly or when his voice became tight during certain conversations. One Friday evening, after a particularly stressful week, Henry found himself sitting alone on the porch with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the sunset. It had been a long week of meetings, projects, and deadlines, and he was exhausted, physically and mentally. The quiet of the evening was a relief, but it also gave him too much time to think. His thoughts kept drifting back to the past, to the family dynamics that had shaped who he was today. He hadn't realized how much time had passed when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Nathan had come out to join him, his posture relaxed but his eyes betraying a quiet restlessness. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch. "Mind if I sit?" Nathan asked, his voice carrying a touch of hesitation, as if uncertain of his place. Henry motioned for him to take the seat next to him. "Of course. It's a nice evening." Nathan sat down, staring out at the view in front of them, the silence between them comfortable but heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward, it was the kind of silence that existed between people who had shared a lifetime of memories and were now in the process of rebuilding those ties. After a long pause, Nathan spoke up again. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Henry. About the way things were between us. How it all went wrong." Henry turned his head, meeting Nathan's gaze. "We both made mistakes, Nathan. It wasn't just you." "I know," Nathan replied, his voice soft but steady. "But I think I was the one who broke it first. I was the one who left, who couldn't deal with anything, who let the past swallow me up." He paused for a moment, almost as if collecting his thoughts. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for that." Henry's heart clenched at the rawness in his brother's voice. He had heard the pain there, the guilt that Nathan carried with him. But Henry had come to realize that no amount of apologies could change the past. They could only affect how they moved forward from here. "You don't need to make up for anything, Nathan," Henry said, his voice surprisingly firm. "What's done is done. All we can do is move forward, piece by piece." Nathan's face softened, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He nodded slowly, taking in Henry's words. "I know. I guess I just keep thinking that maybe I could have done something differently. Maybe if I'd stayed, maybe if I'd fought harder, things would have been different." Henry placed his glass down on the porch railing and turned fully toward Nathan. "We all have our regrets, Nate. I have mine too. But we can't change what's happened. The only thing we can control is how we act now. And I'm choosing to let the past stay where it belongs, behind us." Nathan let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging in a way that spoke volumes. The weight of the years of silence and regret was still there, but Henry could see the flicker of hope in his brother's eyes, the possibility of moving past it. "I'm trying, Henry," Nathan said quietly. "I really am. I know I've got a lot to make up for. But I don't want to be the person I was before. I don't want to keep running from everything." Henry nodded, his hand resting on the arm of the chair. "It's going to take time, Nathan. But I think you're already on the right path. You've started showing up, here, with me, with Emma. That's more than enough for now." The conversation seemed to ease some of the tension between them, as if speaking the truth out loud had lifted a weight from both their shoulders. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, both brothers felt like they were on the same path, walking together, even if at different paces. As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, casting the world into twilight, Henry sat in a comfortable silence with Nathan, the two of them watching as the stars began to appear in the sky. It was a peaceful moment, one that Henry hadn't known he needed until now. They didn't need to say anything more. The weight of the conversation, the shared understanding, was enough. They had both acknowledged the past, and now it was time to focus on the future. The next morning, Henry woke up with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. As he sat in the kitchen, drinking his coffee, Emma joined him with a warm smile on her face. "How was your evening?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. Henry looked up from his mug, meeting her gaze. It was good. I think we're making progress, Emma. We really are. Emma's smile widened. I'm glad to hear that. Henry felt a surge of gratitude toward her. Through all the chaos, all the pain, Emma had been the steady hand, the calm in the storm. She had kept things together when they threatened to fall apart, and her unwavering support had been exactly what both brothers had needed. I don't know if we'll ever be perfect, Emma, Henry said, his voice soft but sincere, but I'm starting to think that's okay. Emma nodded, her eyes warm and full of understanding. You're both doing your best. That's all anyone can ask for. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt a genuine sense of hope for the future. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But the ties that had once seemed so frayed, so beyond repair, were beginning to bind again. And for Henry, that was enough. It was a Saturday morning when the tension in the house became palpable again. Emma had just returned from a morning run, her cheeks flushed from the cool spring air. She was always full of energy, always the first to rise, and always eager to fill the quiet with lightness. But today, something felt off. As she stepped inside, she was met by an unsettling silence. Nathan was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring down into the dark liquid as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. Henry was at the counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, but his movements were slow, deliberate. His eyes flickered to Nathan once, then back to the knife in his hand. Emma paused for a moment, sensing that something had shifted between them. The past few weeks had been a steady progression toward healing, but today felt different. The quiet between the two brothers was thicker, more uncomfortable than it had been before. Everything okay? Emma asked, setting her water bottle down on the counter and wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She moved to the fridge, pulling out fresh fruit to prepare for a smoothie, but her attention was still on the room. The weight of unsaid words was hanging heavy in the air. Nathan looked up at her, his expression hard to read. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, frustration, maybe even fear. He sighed, placing his coffee mug down with a soft clink. Yeah, just thinking. About what? Henry asked, trying to sound casual, though the tension in his voice was obvious. He'd noticed it too, the strain in Nathan's posture, the way he avoided making eye contact. Something had shifted, but what? Nathan opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous gesture that Henry had come to recognize as a sign of deep internal conflict. I don't know. I guess it's just been hard, you know. I've been trying to keep up with everything, to keep it all together. But, it feels like I'm not really here. Like I'm not really part of things. Emma paused, her hand hovering over the fruit in front of her. She turned toward him, her gaze softening. Nathan, you're here. You're part of this, all of this. But I think, no, I know, you've been carrying a lot of weight for a long time. And maybe now it's starting to feel like it's too much. The words hit Henry harder than he expected. For the first time, he truly realized the magnitude of the weight that Nathan had been carrying, the silent burden that had only grown heavier with time. He had been so focused on his own healing that he hadn't fully understood how difficult it still was for Nathan to adjust to the life he had left behind, to step back into a world that he had once abandoned. I've tried to fix everything, but I just keep messing it up, Nathan said, his voice tight. I can't undo the past. I can't undo the things I said, the things I did. I don't even know where to start. Henry set his knife down, turning fully toward his brother. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and sat down at the table next to him. Nathan, you're not supposed to fix everything. You're not supposed to carry all of this by yourself. It's not just on you to make things right. It's on all of us. We're family. And that means we help each other, even when it's hard. Nathan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I don't even know what help looks like anymore. I've spent so many years running from everything, from you, from our parents, from myself. I don't know how to stay, how to be the person I'm supposed to be. Every time I think I'm making progress, I get hit with this fear that it's all going to fall apart again. The vulnerability in Nathan's voice stunned Henry. For years, Nathan had been the one running, the one closing himself off, the one who wouldn't allow anyone in. To hear him say these things, to admit the fear and uncertainty he was grappling with, made Henry realize just how far they had come, and just how much further they still had to go. "You're not alone, Nathan," Henry said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "You don't have to do this by yourself. And I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together. Step by step. That's all we can do." Emma, who had been silently listening, finally spoke up. "It's okay to be afraid, Nathan. But don't let that fear stop you from trying. You don't have to have all the answers, but you do have to show up. You've already started doing that. And that's what matters." Nathan was quiet for a long time, the weight of their words sinking in. His face was a mixture of frustration and relief, the battle between his old habits of hiding and the new reality of openness warring inside him. It was clear that this wasn't something that could be solved in a single conversation, but it was a step, a small, but significant one. Finally, he looked up, meeting both of their gazes with something that almost resembled hope in his eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever feel completely whole again, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try and be here, really here. For you. For both of you." Henry nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "That's all I ask, Nathan. Just show up. Be here with us." The next few days were filled with small victories. Nathan started opening up more, talking about his childhood, the things he had tried to bury, the ways in which his past had shaped him. Henry found himself listening more closely than ever before, not just to the words but to the emotions behind them. Nathan was trying, in his own way, to be a part of the family again. But despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. There were still long silences in the house, still moments when both brothers found themselves retreating into their own worlds, unsure of how to bridge the gap between the past and the present. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the weight of silence was often heavier than either of them wanted to admit. It was during one of these moments of quiet, as Henry was reading in the living room, that he felt Nathan's presence before he heard him. He looked up from the page to find his brother standing in the doorway, looking uncertain. I was thinking," Nathan began, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we should take a trip. Get away for a weekend, just the three of us. I know it sounds kind of sudden, but I think it could help. We've been talking a lot, but I think we need to do something together, something where we can just be." Henry considered this for a moment. A trip, a break from the routine, might be just what they needed to move beyond the tension that still lingered in the house. A chance to be outside their familiar space, to focus on something other than the weight of the past. "I think that's a great idea," Henry said, setting his book down with a smile. "Where were you thinking?" Nathan smiled back, a little sheepish but relieved. "I don't know. Maybe the mountains. Some place quiet." Emma, who had been in the kitchen, overheard and walked into the room. She grinned at the idea. "Mountains sound perfect. Let's do it." And just like that, a simple suggestion had sparked the beginning of a new chapter. A chance for them to leave behind the weight of their silences and create new memories together. The days leading up to their weekend getaway felt like a breath of fresh air for Henry, Nathan, and Emma. They were all eager to escape the routine of daily life, the stress, the tension, the unspoken weight that had been hanging over them for so long. For the first time in what felt like years, they all began to look forward to something, a shared experience that wasn't tied to the past or to the old wounds they had been trying to heal. Nathan had taken the reins when it came to planning the trip. As much as it surprised Henry, it was clear that the gesture meant something significant. Nathan was trying, truly trying, to step up and do things differently. He researched places to stay, mapped out trails for hiking, and even talked about making it a camping trip, though Emma had vetoed the idea in favor of a cozy cabin with a fireplace. In her mind, the only thing she wanted to be roughing it with was the weather, not the lack of amenities. As they packed the car the morning of their departure, there was an air of anticipation between them. There were no huge expectations, no grand plans, just a shared hope that a few days away from everything would give them the space to truly be present with one another. The drive to the mountains was long but scenic, with miles of winding roads that cut through forests and hills, leading them toward the remote cabin Nathan had booked. The closer they got, the quieter the car became. The tension that had been so palpable in their home seemed to dissipate with every mile. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the road felt oddly comforting, a steady pulse that matched the calm in the air. At one point, Nathan spoke up, his voice tentative but filled with something else, something closer to peace than Henry had heard in a long time. "You know," Nathan began, his eyes focused on the road ahead, "I've always been the one who wanted to run away from things. When stuff got tough, I'd just leave, take off, avoid it. But this feels different. Being here, doing this together, it feels like a step towards something better." Emma turned to look at him from the passenger seat, her face soft with understanding. "It's about showing up, right?" she asked. Nathan nodded slowly. "Yeah. Showing up. Even when it's hard." Henry, who had been listening intently, let the words sink in. Nathan had come a long way since the days of self-imposed exile. The man sitting next to him now wasn't perfect, but he was present, and that made all the difference. "It's a big step, Nate. And I'm proud of you for taking it." Nathan smiled, the sincerity in his expression unmistakable. "I'm trying, Henry. I really am." The cabin was everything they had hoped for and more. Nestled in the heart of the mountains, it was isolated enough to offer complete peace and quiet, yet cozy enough to feel like a home away from home. After unpacking, they spent the first evening on the porch, watching the sunset as they sipped on hot tea and coffee. The mountain air was crisp, filling their lungs with a freshness they had all longed for but didn't realize until they arrived. For the first time in what felt like years, there were no pressing deadlines, no unanswered questions, no silent accusations. The space they had between them was filled with something much more valuable: time. Time to just be, to talk, to laugh, and to heal. That evening, as the stars began to emerge in the sky, Henry sat with his back against the wooden railing, gazing up at the vast expanse above them. The constellations seemed clearer here than anywhere else, their sharp brilliance punctuating the endless dark sky. "This is incredible," he said, his voice soft, almost to himself. "I haven't seen the stars like this in so long." Nathan, who had been sitting beside him, followed his gaze and nodded. "It's amazing. Makes you realize how small everything else is." Emma joined them, her smile easy and full of warmth. "It's good to have a reminder of what matters," she said. They all sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant rustling of leaves. For a while, there was no need for words. They were simply together, in the moment, and that was enough. The next morning, they set out for a hike along one of the trails Nathan had found during his research. The sun was just rising, casting a soft golden light across the landscape. The air was cool and invigorating, and the smell of pine trees and earth filled their senses. It was the kind of morning that made Henry feel alive in a way that he hadn't for a long time. As they walked, the conversation naturally shifted between light-hearted banter and more serious topics. They spoke about their childhood, about the things they had loved and lost over the years. Henry found himself listening to Nathan in a way that was different from before, less guarded, more open. At one point, they reached a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. They stopped to take it all in, the vastness of the mountains stretching as far as the eye could see. Nathan, who had always been the more reserved of the two, took a deep breath and let the peace of the moment wash over him. "This is what I needed," Nathan said, almost to himself. This is what I've been looking for. Emma, who had been snapping pictures, turned to face him. What do you mean? She asked gently. Nathan smiled, but it was different this time, more content, less haunted. I've been so focused on fixing everything, on trying to find answers, that I forgot to just be. To just, live. This is where I feel like I can breathe again. Henry felt a knot in his chest loosen. The change in Nathan was subtle but undeniable. The weight he had been carrying was beginning to lift, not because everything had been solved, but because Nathan was starting to realize that healing didn't require perfection, it just required presence. As they continued their hike, the day passed in a blur of laughter, quiet conversations, and moments of reflection. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt the old bond between them growing stronger. The road to healing was long, and there were still many obstacles ahead, but they were facing it together now, as a family. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the three of them sat around a fire pit, toasting marshmallows and talking about the future. The conversation was light, filled with jokes and shared memories, but beneath it all was an unspoken understanding: this trip had been more than just a getaway. It had been a turning point. Later that night, after the fire had died down and the stars were once again filling the sky, Henry stood on the porch, looking out at the view. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had all been on and for the journey they were still on. There was still so much to work through, so much healing left to do, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. They had come this far, together. Nathan joined him quietly, standing next to him on the porch as they both took in the view. I don't know what's next, Henry, Nathan said softly. But I think I'm ready for it. Whatever it is. Henry smiled, turning to his brother. We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it the same way we've faced everything else, together. For the first time, Nathan didn't look away. He met Henry's gaze with a steadiness that spoke volumes. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it felt a little less daunting now that they had each other. The days in the mountains were peaceful and rejuvenating, but the looming reality of their return to the world below hung over them as they packed their bags on the final morning of their trip. The fresh mountain air, the quiet nights, and the simple joy of being together had allowed them to find a semblance of peace. But now, as they prepared to leave, it felt like the old weight of their lives was beginning to creep back in, like shadows returning as the sun rose higher in the sky. It was Emma who first broke the silence, sensing the subtle tension in the air. They were loading the car, the sound of suitcases being shoved into the trunk punctuating the otherwise still morning. I don't want to go, she said, not looking up from her task. There was a wistful quality to her voice, a longing that Henry hadn't heard before. He understood completely. They had spent a few days disconnected from the pressures of the outside world, and it had felt like an escape. I just want to stay here forever. Nathan, who had been standing by the car, loading up the last of their things, glanced over at her. I get it, he said, his voice quiet. It's peaceful here. No noise. No distractions. Just, us. Henry joined them, putting the final suitcase in the trunk. He exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the distant peaks of the mountains that had become their refuge. I know it feels like that now, but we can't stay here forever. We've got to go back, face everything we've been avoiding. Emma looked at him, her expression soft but serious. But we don't have to let it consume us. The peace we found here, let's try to bring some of it back with us. Nathan nodded, a flicker of something determined in his eyes. I'm not going to let everything fall apart again. I'm done running. I can't keep avoiding things. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to face it. The three of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the words hanging between them. They had all been running from something, in different ways. And now, in the stillness of the mountains, they had finally come to a point where they understood that running wasn't an option anymore. The only way forward was through it, together. The drive back was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. The world outside the car had changed. The vibrant greens of the mountains had given way to the familiar, crowded streets of the city. As the familiar skyline came into view, Emma let out a deep sigh, knowing that their temporary escape was about to end. The challenges that lay ahead were still there, waiting for them. But Nathan's words from earlier lingered in Henry's mind. "I'm done running." There was something about that statement that felt like a turning point, a promise. For the first time in a long time, Henry believed that his brother was truly ready to face the future. When they arrived back at their house, it felt different. It wasn't the same place they had left behind just a few days ago. It was as if the space itself had shifted, reflecting the change within each of them. The walls no longer seemed to close in with pressure and uncertainty. The air was lighter, somehow more breathable. The next few days were filled with small, yet significant, changes. Nathan had taken the first step by acknowledging that he couldn't do it alone, and now, he was taking the next step by being present. The tension that had marked their home for so long was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding that things would not always be easy, but they could face them together. Emma had resumed her normal routine, but there was a new energy in her. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore, she was looking forward to the future, to the possibilities that lay ahead. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They were healing, not because everything had magically fixed itself, but because they were showing up for each other in ways they hadn't before. It was a week later when Nathan sat down with Henry in the living room, a rare moment of stillness between the two of them. Emma was out running errands, leaving the house quiet once more. "I've been thinking," Nathan began, his hands clasped tightly together, a habit that Henry had grown used to when his brother was deep in thought. "About what you said. About how we can't run anymore." Henry didn't interrupt. He had learned that sometimes Nathan needed time to speak, to work through his thoughts. He waited, patient. "I don't think I fully realized how much I've been running from. From everything. My mistakes, my past, my fears. But being here, being with you and Emma, I'm starting to understand that I don't have to carry all of that alone. It's a lot. But I think I'm ready to face it now." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Nathan wasn't just talking about facing his past. He was talking about facing their future, together. He was ready to rebuild, to take accountability for the choices he had made, and to take the steps forward that had once seemed too daunting. "You don't have to do it alone, Nate," Henry said, his voice steady. "I've got your back, always. And so does Emma." Nathan nodded slowly, as if the weight of those words was sinking in. "I know. I'm starting to believe it, too." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the bond between them stronger than it had been in years. The uncertainty of the future still loomed, but there was a new sense of resolve in Nathan's voice, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. The healing wasn't going to be immediate, but they had taken the first steps. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt hope. Later that evening, Emma joined them for dinner, a homemade meal that smelled like comfort. The three of them sat around the table, eating, talking, and laughing. The atmosphere in the house had shifted completely. The walls felt like they were filled with possibility rather than regret. They were moving forward, not because everything was perfect, but because they were learning to live with imperfection, together. After dinner, they sat outside in the backyard, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Emma leaned against Henry, and Nathan stood off to the side, his hands tucked in his pockets, his gaze far away. But this time, the distance between them wasn't filled with tension or fear. It was filled with a sense of understanding, of a journey not yet finished but already well on its way. Nathan finally spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not afraid of the future anymore." Emma smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Neither am I." Henry looked at them both, his heart full. They had come so far, each of them, and though there was still much work to be done, he believed in them. He believed in their ability to face whatever came next. Together. The days following their deep conversation in the backyard were filled with a sense of quiet optimism. Henry, Nathan, and Emma had each experienced their own personal growth, but now, as a family, they were embracing a new beginning. There was no grand revelation, no sudden change in the air, just a collective realization that they were finally on the right path. It had been 2 weeks since they returned from their trip to the mountains, and already, there was a noticeable shift in the way they interacted with one another. Their home, once a place filled with tension and unspoken words, now felt like a space for healing and understanding. They weren't just coexisting anymore, they were living together, truly living. Nathan had started taking more responsibility for the little things. Helping out with household chores, offering to cook dinner, and even taking Emma out for evening walks. These may have seemed like small gestures, but to Emma, they were monumental. Every time he made an effort, it was a small promise that he was trying, that he was committed to doing better. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Nathan turned to Henry with a thoughtful expression. "I was thinking about what we talked about," he said, his voice serious but calm. "About not running from things anymore. And I think I'm ready to face the next step." Henry raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to do something about the things I've been avoiding. I want to make things right with the people I've hurt, people I've distanced myself from. I can't just live in the past anymore," Nathan said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of vulnerability in it. "I'm ready to make amends." The weight of Nathan's words hung in the air. For a long time, he had been the one running, the one keeping his distance from the people who mattered most. But now, he was taking the first step toward rebuilding those relationships, something that had seemed impossible not too long ago. Henry didn't say anything at first. He was processing, letting the words sink in. But then, he nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you, Nate. Really. This is a big step. But you're not alone in it." Nathan smiled, a small, genuine smile that had become increasingly common. "I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you about it. I can't do this alone. Not anymore." Henry reached out, giving his brother's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together." The next few weeks were filled with small, but powerful changes. Nathan reached out to a few of the people he had distanced himself from over the years, starting with old friends and family members. It wasn't easy. Some people were wary, unsure if this was just another temporary attempt to patch things up. But Nathan was persistent, showing through his actions that he was ready to change. Emma, too, was beginning to see a new side of Nathan. She had always known him as someone who struggled to open up, but now, he was beginning to do so. They started having deeper conversations, ones that weren't just about surface-level things, but about their hopes, their dreams, and even their fears. As the weeks passed, the three of them spent more time together, reconnecting not just as a family, but as individuals who had learned to be vulnerable and honest with one another. They didn't have all the answers, but they were learning to walk the path of healing together. And that, they all realized, was enough. One evening, as the sun began to set, the three of them found themselves on the porch once again, this time without the weight of old resentments clouding their thoughts. They had come a long way from the fractured family they had been just a few months ago. They were not perfect, but they were whole, and that was more than they had hoped for. Nathan turned to them both, his expression one of quiet contentment. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant when you said that healing takes time," he said softly. "It's not something that just happens overnight. It's a process, and it's messy. But it's worth it." Emma smiled, her eyes warm with affection. "It is worth it. All the small steps, all the struggles, they lead to something better. Something real." Henry, who had been silent up until that point, looked out at the horizon, his mind drifting back to the moment they had first arrived home from their trip. It had felt like the end of one chapter, the closing of a painful chapter in their lives. But now, sitting on the porch with his brother and Emma, he realized that it wasn't an end at all. It was a beginning. A new beginning, he murmured, almost to himself. Nathan nodded, his eyes distant but filled with purpose. Yeah. A new beginning. The next morning, as Henry made his coffee, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had all been through. They had come so far, and yet, he knew there was still more work to be done. There would always be challenges, always moments where they would stumble or feel unsure. But now, they had the tools to face it. They had learned to be vulnerable with each other, to ask for help, and to show up even when it was hard. They had learned that healing wasn't a straight line. It was full of ups and downs, detours and setbacks. But most importantly, they had learned that they didn't have to face it alone. Later that day, after Henry had finished his morning routine, he called Nathan into the kitchen. "I've been thinking," Henry said as Nathan entered the room. "About what you said last night. About making amends. I think it's time we all make our own amends. To each other. To ourselves." Nathan paused, considering the suggestion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've all been carrying things. Things we haven't talked about. And I think it's time we do that," Henry explained. "We owe it to ourselves, and to each other." Nathan smiled, a look of understanding passing between them. "I think you're right. Let's do it. Let's start fresh. For real this time." Emma, who had just walked in, overheard their conversation. She looked between them both, a smile creeping onto her face. "Starting fresh sounds good to me," she said. And so, that's exactly what they did. Each day, they worked through their past, talking about things that had been buried for years. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes the conversations were painful. But they did it together. They learned to forgive, to move past their mistakes, and to embrace the love that had always been there, even when it was hard to see. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real, and it was theirs. The journey was just beginning, and Henry knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a family. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with that. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?